Hi, welcome back to my channel. This week I want to talk about a genre that I've kind of grown to love, and it's actually kind of very new for me, so it's kind of cool to talk about. It's hard-boiled crime fiction. It's something I've never read before. I actually never really thought I'd even like before. I don't really remember reading mysteries and liking those, which is kind of weird because I've always liked really strange kind of fiction. Like I was a big fan of Lost, which is just a long series of mysteries that, if you've seen it, it doesn't really answer anything at the end. But that was always just kind of fun of like, what's going on? What does this mean? What does this mean? And sometimes the resolutions of those questions was satisfying, sometimes not so much. Um, I kind of remember as a kid liking things like the movies like Death on the Nile, Evil Under the Sun. Um, they're still pretty cool. I actually rewatched Death of the Nile not too long ago, and it was still really cool to watch. But I never really got into like the film noir stuff or anything else like that. And some people break up hard boiled crime from film noir. I kind of think they go a lot together. I think there's enough overlap that I'm not sure how much you really need these two different um, categories. But so I'll probably use them a little bit interchangeably. But hard-boiled crime fiction or hard-boiled fiction in general started off in the 1920s, kind of picked up in the 30s, and really exploded more like in the 40s and the 50s. This is a lot like Sam Spade. This is the Philip Marlowe stuff, written by people like Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, Lester Dent was kind of in this category. More modern types are like Max Allan Collins, and a few other types. I'm gonna kind of put up some pictures here of some different authors. Lawrence Block is another big one. And what was interesting about hard-boiled crime fiction is that it kind of grew out of the 1920s, kind of grew out of the Prohibition era, a lot of gangster kind of crime. It usually involves around an anti-hero, maybe some of the first anti-heroes. I mean, because this stuff, like, this predates Batman. This predates Punisher by a long shot. It predates a lot of these old characters that we think of. I mean, like the Shadow kind of grew out of this time period. A lot of characters, probably most people have never really heard of anymore. They form that sort of fiction. Batman is probably the most famous superhero that would fit under that sort of umbrella of hard case crime. Um, it's like I said, it's an anti-hero. It is someone who's kind of working outside the law or maybe adjacent to the law. So that's why you see a lot of like private investigators, like Sam Spade is in this one. Mike Hammer, how could I forget about Mike Hammer? Written by Mickey Spillane. These were guys who, as Mike Hammer would always put, he can do the things that the cops aren't allowed to do. He can break the rules and stuff. So he's and he's friends with the cops. Speaks very highly of the cops. He doesn't like the politicians that kind of limit the cops, prevent them from doing things. He kind of bristles against the system that sometimes lets people go, again, very much like the Punisher from Marvel Comics. It's easier just to, if you kill a villain, then he just stays dead and he never gets back up again. You don't have to worry about him again. That's the sort of, logic of the hard-boiled crime fiction. They're usually much more gritty, much more street level, because there were some sort of like quote-unquote superheroes. That was kind of what Mickey Spillane had in mind with Mike Hammer, and Mickey Spillane had written for comic books. And I think his idea was Mike Hammer would be like a comic book sort of character. So it's much more sort of gritty, street-level crime, dealing with organized crime, lots of corruption, dealing with corrupt politicians, corrupt judges. All of this sort of grew out of the Prohibition era, and then it's just stuck around from the 30s. And even by the time we get into the 40s and 50s, Prohibition was long over, but there was still that kind of attitude on the streets. If you watch some movies, I think Mulholland Falls, not Mulholland Drive, that's another great movie, but Mulholland Falls, I think The Black Dahlia. There's some other movies, L.A. Confidential. They take place in this 1940s, 50s era of mainly California, talking about the corruption and on the streets. Now there's drugs and stuff. Really, I mean, actually, the first Godfather movie is pretty much in that same category. It starts with Michael Corleone coming home from World War II. So this is like right in the mid 40s, and this is, you know, the gangsters and the crime bosses and that sort of stuff fighting over drugs in the street, and this is all in that same hard-boiled fiction kind of era. So if you like gangster movies, you'll probably like hard-boiled fiction because it kind of fits in that same notion, except, you know, you're probably watching more about most of these books are really more about the guy fighting against the gangsters, but it's that same kind of level. Some of this can, to be honest, feels a little dated, mainly because of the time period. It's hard, you know. One of the books, the big thing is that there's you know, young women who want to be models or actresses, and they get caught up in being prostitutes, and in the prostitution ring they're using it as blackmail for high level people and politicians. And maybe when Mickey Spillane was writing that in, I think it's 1950, if I'm remembering the right book. In 1950, that might have been really shocking. Today, it's kind of like, oh, yeah, that's business as usual. Although, to be honest, as I'm filming this, we're still talking about Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, or however you say her name. They were doing basically the same thing, except they're involving underage girls. Same thing, you know, they groom the girls, and, you know, the Prince of England and, you know, former presidents and business leaders and all these other people are on his airplane going out to his island doing who knows what. That's actually hard-boiled crime fiction right there. This one's just kind of done at more of an international level, where in the book it was just talking about New York City. It's very urban focused as well. Let's see, Mike Hammer takes place in New York. Raymond Chandler books, the Philip Marlowe books, those take place in San Francisco, I believe, if I remember right. Maybe it's L.A. I know it's Sam Spade. His book, Hammett, Deschanel Hammett, I think is how you say his name, for the Maltese Falcon. He was in San Francisco. There were some other old stories that took place in all sorts of other settings. I'm actually surprised there wasn't more taking place in Chicago, but maybe at the time, you know, nobody wanted to write about Chicago or something like that. So it's very interesting. Basically, the books kind of write as if in any urban setting this sort of thing could take place, and you could be writing about these. I do think we're kind of branching out. I recently watched Hell or High Water, really great movie with Jeff Bridges and Chris Pines, I believe that's his name. Great movie. It's kind of like a hard-boiled crime fiction mixed with a Western, because it takes place out in West Texas. But they're basically running around robbing banks, talking about the corruption of the banks and how they're working to keep people down. They're talking about the poverty of the people living out in those small towns. And then, you know, their own desperation in some ways. And so it's very hard-boiled crime fiction, but at the same time it takes place out in West Texas, and it has a lot of those hallmarks of running around and robbing banks and not really wanting to hurt anybody, but they need the money, and so they want the money, and they cross the border and hide out in a Indian reservation. You know, in this case it was a casino. So hard-boiled, I think, kind of can fill other areas. The book I'm working on right now, the working title is My Blade is Quick, because it's a rip-off of the Mike Hammer book, My Gun is Quick. It's a hard-boiled crime fiction novel taking place in a fantasy setting of my own creation. And so I kind of want to bring those two ideas together as well. Because hard-boiled crime fiction, it's more of an attitude than anything else. An attitude towards mysteries. This is not Sherlock Holmes. This is not Agatha Christie. This is not Murder, She Wrote. These are not the cozies. This is a place where people are going to die gruesomely. You know, they're going to be beaten, and you're going to describe the teeth flying out of their skull and punch them in the gut until they vomit. And lots of women going to take their clothes off and going to have, you know, very kinky sex and that sort of stuff. Kinky for that time period, because it's 1940s and 50s. They do make allusions to a gay bar and that sort of thing. In that sense, it's also a little bit dated. If you're going to read any Mickey Spillane, Mike Hammer, a lot of the hard-boiled crime fiction from that time period, get ready to read a lot of stereotypes, because that was the time period where these stereotypes were actually developed. Stereotypes of people of color, of women, of LGBT community. This was not a very politically correct era, so to speak. But it gives you a good window into what people were thinking and what they were living like back then. Another aspect of hard-boiled crime is James M. Cain. I'm really digging his books. He wrote Double Indemnity, and he also wrote Postman Always Rings Twice, which I'm reading right now. Both are really great books. They don't really fit the same mold. I think a lot of people would probably categorize them as noir fiction as opposed to hard-boiled crime fiction, mainly because we're seeing the stories from the perspective of the criminals. And in both cases, these are very personal stories. Women who basically want to kill off their husbands. Men who fall madly in love with women, madly in lust at least, and are easily manipulated into killing these women. And so really much more of the story isn't so much of like who did it, because I know exactly who did it. We're following their perspective. What we're trying to figure out is like, are they going to get away with it? And if they do, how? And should they? You know, these are sort of people you want to get away with these sort of crimes. That's also an aspect. Like I said, that's probably more noir fiction than what some people would call hardboiled, but I kind of put it all together in one same block. But there's still a lot of great old stories that were written. I'm currently, through audiobooks at least, listening to some of the old great Pulp Fiction stories. There's I think it's Otto Penzler. I think that's his name. Otto Penzler has put out these big, thick books of these old stories, like from BLACKMASK and some other stories that have been out of print for a long time. And these are the stories that influenced the others. You know, this was Raymond Chandler writing before he was Raymond Chandler. This is the guys who influenced, you know, Mickey Spillane. So, and it also influenced a lot of society as well. Some of these stories are taking place in the early 1920s, just after World War I, long before World War II was even being really imagined. We're talking about 100-year-old stories, actually, and a lot of them are just as impressive today as they were back then. You just have to kind of think about the world in light. There's still modern-day hard-boiled crime fiction. Probably my favorite that I've read so far is by Max Allan Collins. He's written quite a bit. He's been around for decades. I think he started writing in the 70s. He's been writing consistently ever since. He has a series of books called Quarry, and it follows a former Marine out of Vietnam, out of the Vietnam War, and he didn't have a job. Didn't have a job, didn't have any prospects, and got picked up by this guy. I think they call him the broker, who basically runs a hitman agency. And so it's Quarry working with another guy running around committing crimes and stuff. And so again, it's that sort of, in this case, we're looking more from the criminal angle than the private investigator angle. But Max Allan Collins really embodies the spirit of hard-boiled crime. And the Quarry books are really interesting. I've only really read one, but I liked it so much that I'm already sold. And I didn't even like read one of the first ones. I sort of like grabbed a book off the shelf and read it and realized I'm kind of in the middle of a series. But he does such a good job of introducing the character and giving you such a history that I didn't read any of the other books. Now it's just fine. You know, you kind of pick up any of them and read them at any point. Probably the best place to find these kinds of books is a publisher called Hard Case Crime. and a lot of the images that I'm going to be posting on this video were by Hard Case Crime. They have been trying to recapture those stories. So the guys who run the publishing house write these sort of stories, which are also really excellent stories, and they've been publishing them. But then they've also been going back and trying to get some of these older stories that maybe were never published or out of print or something, and then bring them back. I think all of Max Allan Collins' stories have been published through there as well. Stephen King has even written a few. The Colorado Kid is published through them. I think they have a new one out by Stephen King as well. To be honest, I wasn't that crazy about the Colorado Kid. It's well written because it's Stephen King, but it's a mystery looking for a mystery, so to speak. So I read it because I knew that the TV show Haven was based off of the book Colorado Kid, and to be honest, they have nothing to do with each other. In the TV show they totally shoehorned the name in Colorado Kid just to say, oh, it's based on a book by Stephen King. They have nothing to do with each other. I think the only other thing they have to do with each other is it takes place in a small town in Maine, like all other Stephen King books. Has two elderly guys who run the town newspaper, and they befriend a young woman. That's right. Except in the TV show, she's an FBI agent. You know. So anyway, has really nothing to do with anything. So, but yeah, Hard Case Crime, their publishing house, puts out a lot of these really good stories, and so if you pick up almost any of them, then you'll be good. I would suggest any of the Max Allan Collins books just to get you started. If you want to start with something, if you want to start with something kind of quick, kind of easy. I like Double Indemnity and Postman Always Rings Twice, even though I'm not even finished with it yet. Those James M. Cain. They're fairly short, they're fairly easy to read, but they have a really great depth, and you really feel the characters, and you kind of are simultaneously rooting for them, and you also don't want them to win. But that's the moral ambiguity of noir and hard-boiled crime fiction. But anyway, this is just a little introduction to a genre I've come to love. I will be probably talking more about this later, because like I said, I'm still working on a book. I'm hoping to be done writing it in late August. I had a little snafu last week and had to rewrite some, but hopefully I'll have it done later August, and I don't know, I'm going to try and see if I can get it published with somebody, or if not, I'll just self-publish it like everything else. But anyway, I will talk to you later.